They called her Invisible Katie. The ICU nurses on the 4th floor thought it was funny. Dr. Blackwell used it in front of patients during rounds, his voice carrying across the cardiac ward like a tank idling in an expensive garage. "Where's Invisible Katie? Oh, there she is, easy to miss when you barely make a dent." The laughter followed him like a cologne he'd paid too much for. At staff handoff meetings, he'd lean back in his chair, fingers steepled, and announce to the room, "Katie, try speaking up." Some of us can't hear mediocrity. Nobody corrected him. Nobody defended her. They simply looked away, the way people do when they sense a hierarchy violation might cost them. They didn't know her hands had sutured wounds under mortar fire in Mosul. They didn't know that the way she stood, feet shoulder-width apart, weight distributed forward on the balls of her feet, always positioned near the nearest exit, was muscle memory from 20 years embedded with Army Rangers, her nervous system permanently calibrated for instant movement. Katie Rodriguez worked night shift at Sacred Heart Hospital in Portland, Oregon, monitoring beeping ventilators and dripping full lines with the quiet competence of someone who'd saved lives in worse conditions than an air-conditioned ICU. She wore scrubs one size too large, charcoal gray that made her nearly invisible against the institutional walls. Her hair was always pulled back in a regulation bun, dark and tight, not a strand out of place. She spoke only when necessary, her voice just above a whisper, her eyes always on the machines, never on the staff. When she walked, her boots, old leather ones with reinforced soles, made almost no sound on the tile floors. The ventilators wheezed their mechanical rhythm as she moved between beds, checking O2 saturation, confirming medication times, reading the small vital sign story each patient told in numbers. Inside her jacket lining, sewn with stitches that had begun to fray after 2 decades of carrying weight, was a faded unit patch from her last operation in Mosul. The embroidered insignia had faded to the color of dried blood. She never removed the jacket, even in summer. The patch was the only physical proof of who she'd been before she became invisible. The scar pattern on her forearms looked like shrapnel damage. 3 linear marks, each roughly 2 inches long, running parallel down the inside of her left arm. When patients asked, she'd say, "Kitchen accident years ago." They never asked about her right arm, which had a longer, more dramatic scar that disappeared under her sleeve. That one she didn't explain. This week, Katie had caught 2 errors in Dr. Blackwell's post-op orders. The first was a vancomycin dose 30% too high for a 92-year-old patient with compromised renal function. The second was a premature removal order on a patient's chest tube. The lung hadn't fully re-expanded on the last X-ray. She'd corrected both silently in the electronic health record system, using the provider correction function, which flagged the changes to the attending but didn't name the corrector. Dr. Blackwell never acknowledged the corrections. He simply updated his orders and moved on as if he'd caught his own mistakes. By Tuesday, the ICU supervisor was asking Katie's opinion before implementing his protocols. That was when Dr. Blackwell's jaw had tightened, and his eyes had found her in the corner of the monitoring station, her fingers moving across a keyboard. His look lasted exactly 2 seconds. It contained 18 years of medical school debt and a 5,200 square foot house in the West Hills and a board position at the country club and the unspoken arrangement that doctors were architects and nurses were carpenters. The look said, "You're overstepping." The look said, "I see you now." Katie had felt it the way soldiers feel a target being painted on their chest. She didn't react. She simply returned her attention to the monitor, watching the green line of a cardiac rhythm dance across the screen, steady and controlled. Her fingers didn't tremble. Her breathing didn't change. When pain arrives as information, and a warning look from a threatened man was pain, a specific kind, you acknowledge it, catalog it, and continue the mission. On Wednesday morning, a deaf patient named Marcus Chen arrived at the Sacred Heart ER intake desk with a construction injury. His forearm was wrapped in blood-stained gauze, and he was using quick, efficient sign language with his hands, trying to communicate with the intake nurse, a young woman who kept saying "I don't understand" louder and louder, as if volume would bridge the gap. Katie was passing through the lobby on her way to the pharmacy when she saw him. She stopped moving. Everything stopped moving. The fluorescent light seemed to flicker in slow motion. The rain hammering against the glass doors became the only sound. She recognized him immediately. Not from a photo. Not from a memory. From the way he moved his hands when he was frustrated, that specific arc of the right wrist, the slight delay in the left-hand response. 8 years old, pulled from a collapsed building in the Jolan district of Fallujah, covered in dust that looked like the color of dried bones. She'd held him while waiting for medevac, and because he was deaf and frightened and she needed him calm, she'd taught him 5 simple signs in the 42 minutes before the helicopter arrived: okay, safe, water, pain, and wait. She'd signed them over and over while the shells fell around them, her hand steady because steadiness was all she had to give. This wasn't possible. He wasn't supposed to be here. Marcus was now probably 28 years old, tall and lean with the posture of someone who'd spent time in the military, shoulders back, spine straight, the kind of carriage that came from basic training and formation marching. He was signing again to the intake nurse, more insistently now: pain, help, doctor. The nurse was clearly overwhelmed. Katie could read it in the nurse's face, the calculation happening behind her eyes, the inventory of excuses forming. Too complicated. No sign language interpreter on staff. Liability concerns. Better to refer him elsewhere. Then Dr. Blackwell appeared in the hallway behind the intake desk. He glanced at Marcus, at the blood-stained gauze, at the nurse's distressed expression. His face moved through a sequence of micro-expressions: annoyance, calculation, decision. He approached the intake counter and said, loudly, "We're not equipped for this. Send him to Mercy General." Then he turned away. 3 other doctors had already refused Marcus that week. Katie knew this because she'd heard them say so, heard them discussing the communication barriers and patient safety concerns, which were polite ways of saying difficult, which was another way of saying he wasn't worth the liability. Marcus would have been the 4th refusal, but as Dr. Blackwell turned to leave, Katie's body moved. She didn't remember deciding to move. Her feet simply carried her forward, her voice emerging, quiet but present, with a clarity that made several people in a lobby turn. "I can help." Dr. Blackwell stopped. He turned slowly, his eyes finding Katie across the waiting room like a predator acquiring a target. His expression didn't change, but something shifted in the temperature of the room. She could feel it the way you feel a barometric drop before a storm. He looked at her for 3 seconds. Then he smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who'd just been given exactly the information he needed. "Just a nurse," he said, his voice gentle and patronizing, pitched for the benefit of the patients and visitors within earshot. "That's very kind of you, Katie. But we need medical assessment first." He said her name the way you'd say the name of a child who'd offered to help build something complicated. Then he turned to the intake nurse, "Page orthopedics. If they can't take him, social services will coordinate a transfer." He walked away. Back to his kingdom. Back to his rounds and his authority and the 17 years of seniority that made him untouchable in this building. Katie stood in the middle of the lobby. Marcus was looking at her, his eyes searching her face with the intensity of someone trying to remember something buried in childhood. She signed to him, her hands moving with the language of 42 minutes from 2 decades ago. "Okay. Safe. Wait." His eyes widened. His mouth opened. He signed back, quickly, almost frantically, "Who are you?" Katie didn't answer. She couldn't answer. Instead, she said to the intake nurse, "I'm going on break. I need some Jell-O." It wasn't funny. It wasn't supposed to be. It was just the kind of thing you say when you need to move, when you need to think, when you need to hide what your face might reveal. But that wasn't the problem. The problem was that Dr. Blackwell had seen her step forward. He'd seen her communicate with a patient everyone else had given up on. He'd seen her matter. And in hospital hierarchies, there's no punishment worse than becoming visible when you've been designed to be forgotten. Katie returned to the ICU 15 minutes later, her hand steady, her breathing controlled, her face neutral. She didn't check on Marcus. She didn't ask the intake nurse what had happened or whether orthopedics would take his case. She simply returned to her station and opened the next patient's chart, watching the heart monitor display its rhythm, strong, steady, predictable. The way her own heartbeat would not be, not anymore. Because she'd been placed at Sacred Heart for one specific reason, to monitor Marcus Chen, to watch for the trafficking network that had followed her home from Mosul like a shadow with teeth, and now her cover as an ordinary, invisible night shift nurse was developing cracks. She pulled out the unit patch from her jacket lining and felt the fraying stitches beneath her fingertips, a reminder of something she'd tried very hard to forget. The mandatory staff meeting was scheduled for Thursday at 7 in the morning, which meant Katie arrived at 6:15 to prepare the conference room, resetting chairs that didn't need resetting, arranging water pitchers in precise angles. The fluorescent lights hummed their antiseptic song overhead. 43 nursing staff filtered in over 15 minutes, clutching coffee cups like life rafts, their tired eyes scanning for safe seats in the back. Dr. Blackwell arrived last, which meant his arrival. He carried his tablet. His smile was the smile of someone who'd already decided how this would end. "Good morning, everyone," he said, his voice moving through the room like oil spreading across water. "I wanted to discuss some recent inconsistencies in protocol adherence. Nothing serious. Just housekeeping." He tapped his tablet twice. The screen behind him illuminated. "But first, I have a quick question for our newer staff." He paused, letting the silence expand. "Katie? Since you've been so helpful correcting my orders lately, perhaps you can enlighten us." The room's energy shifted. Shoulders tensed. Two nurses exchanged a look. Katie sat in the third row, her hands flat on the table in front of her. She didn't move. "Not yet. Let me ask you something basic," Blackwell continued, his tone suggesting nothing about this would be basic. "Pediatric dosing for amoxicillin suspension in cases of acute otitis media. What's the protocol, Katie? The standard dosing, I mean." She knew the answer. Everyone in that room knew she knew the answer. The question wasn't about amoxicillin. The question was about whether she would be allowed to know anything at all. 25 milligrams per kilogram, twice daily, Katie said quietly. For 10 days. Blackwell nodded. That would be correct. If we were still practicing medicine in 2004. He walked closer to her. Not threatening. Worse than threatening, performative. The current standard, as I'm sure you're aware since you're so current with everything, is 45 milligrams per kilogram per day, divided into 3 doses. 37 years of experience tends to keep one updated on these matters. The room went still. A nurse in the second row, Martina's, ICU, looked down at her coffee cup as if it might save her. "Next question," Blackwell said. He was enjoying this. His voice had the quality of a man who'd rehearsed this in the shower, who'd practiced the exact cadence of each cut. The contraindications for metoprolol in hypertensive emergency. "Go ahead." Katie's jaw tightened fractionally. "One breath. Just one." "Cardiogenic shock," she answered. "Decompensated heart failure. AV block greater than first degree." "Excellent memory," Blackwell said. "Of outdated information. The current evidence suggests," he paused, letting everyone absorb the word current, "that metoprolol's role in hypertensive emergency is actually far more nuanced than your textbooks indicate. But why would we expect a night shift nurse to read the literature that came out after her graduation? 12 more minutes. That's how long it lasted. 12 more questions, each framed like a test, each designed to expose the distance between what she knew and the specific way he needed her to be wrong. The room didn't squirm. Rooms don't squirm. But the people in it did, in their seats, in their fingers, in the way their eyes found anything to look at except Katie's face. When Blackwell finally released her, his parting words were, "Invisible Katie strikes again. Thank you for keeping us all honest." The meeting adjourned at 7:43. No one spoke to her as they filed out. No one made eye contact. The silence wasn't neutral, it was choice, it was selection, it was the sound of people deciding which side they were on. Katie stood and began resetting the chairs again, though no one had asked her to. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song. She let one tear escape and wiped it without pausing in her work, without breaking eye contact with the wall she was facing. 2 days later, in the elevator on the 4th floor, she was alone when Dr. Blackwell stepped in. She knew it was him before she turned. She'd learned to recognize the pressure change that came with his presence, the way the air density altered when someone who decided your invisibility was unacceptable entered a room. He waited until the doors closed. Then he pressed the emergency stop button. The elevator lurched. Katie didn't stumble. Her body was too well trained for that, the kind of training you didn't forget even when you pretended you'd never received it. "Tell me something," Blackwell said. He was taller than her by 5 inches. He was using those 5 inches. Did you sleep your way through nursing school, or did they just have very low standards that semester? The question hung in the fluorescent air like a blade that had already cut. Katie's breathing didn't change. Her posture remained perfect, the posture of someone who'd been taught to stand in rubble without flinching, to take insults and convert them into information, into data, into something that could be catalogued and filed away. She looked at him with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived worse than this man would ever understand. "I earned my place," she said. Her voice was steady, measured. "Can you say the same?" For a moment, Blackwell's face showed something authentic, something beneath the rehearsed arrogance. Fury. The fury of a man who'd expected invisibility to make her compliant, and instead found something harder. He released the emergency stop. The elevator descended. When the doors opened on the ground floor, Katie stepped out without looking back. She could feel him watching her go. She could feel the calculation happening in his brain, how to respond to someone who wouldn't break, who wouldn't cry, who wouldn't accept the role he'd written for her. That was the moment he decided it wasn't enough anymore. That was the moment he began planning something more permanent than words. Monday morning, Katie opened her staff locker at 6:58 a.m. The interior was spray-painted in dripping red letters, "Wetback RN." The paint was still slightly wet. It smelled like chemical fire and hatred, sharp enough to sting her sinuses. The letters didn't drip like rain on a window. They dripped like blood from a wound that wouldn't heal. She didn't call security. She didn't report it. She stood in front of the open locker for 12 seconds, and then she pulled out her phone and photographed it, every angle, every drip, every letter, and then she called maintenance. Her voice on the phone was professionally bland, reporting vandalism the way someone reports a scheduling conflict. By 8:30, the locker had been scrubbed. By 9 o'clock, there was no evidence except in the photograph on her phone and in the knowledge of what happened when a woman stopped being invisible. She became a target. That afternoon, she saw Dr. Blackwell walking past the supply room where she was inventorying 4 lines. He didn't stop. He didn't need to. His voice carried, "Vandalism is such a problem these days. Maybe if you'd made more friends here, people would think you were worth protecting." He was speaking to the doorframe, not to her, which made it worse. Not worse, different. Worse meant it hurt. This was worse because it meant he'd stop caring whether it hurt. He'd already won. She was just the loser learning to live with the loss. Katie took one measured breath. She let one tear escape. She wiped it without looking away from the 4 bags she was counting. She said nothing at all. But her hand shook for the first time, not from fear, but from something older and deeper. The trembling wasn't weakness. It was restraint. It was the sound of someone who'd been taught to kill with her hands, learning to count for bags instead. She finished the inventory at 3:14 p.m. That's when she saw Marcus Chen in the lobby. He was alone, which was the problem. He was sitting in a plastic chair with his phone's translation app open, trying to explain something to a physician's assistant who kept nodding with the kind of politeness reserved for people you've already decided not to help. The PA was backing away, clearly uncomfortable with the conversation, clearly ready to refer him to someone else, someone who wasn't her responsibility. Katie had seen it 11 times in the past 6 weeks, doctors and nurses and administrators looking at Marcus Chen and seeing exactly what they expected to see: complicated, difficult, not worth the effort. She walked toward him without deciding to. Her legs made the choice. She sat down beside him and asked, "Can I help?" Marcus looked up. His eyes were the color of burned tea. He started to type into his translation app, then paused. He studied her for 2 seconds. Then he raised his hands. Katie knew ASL because there was an 8-year-old boy in Mosul in 2003 who'd lost his hearing in an IED blast while his translator father was dead beside him, and while waiting for medevac on a rooftop overlooking the Jolan district, you learn very quickly how to communicate with a traumatized child who couldn't hear. You learn tactical signs. You learned the specific hand formations that could convey meaning without sound. You learned how to say safety and home and you're okay and I won't leave you, all with your hands forming shapes in the hot dust. She raised her hands and signed back, "I'll help you." His eyes widened. Not from recognition, not yet. But from something like recognition, like the ghost of recognition, like he'd just heard an accent from home after 20 years and couldn't quite place it. "You know tactical signs," he signed. "I know some," Katie signed back. She kept her movement small, careful, designed to calm rather than engage. "Let me help with your appointment. Can you do that?" He nodded slowly. Katie brought him to an examination room and arranged for a physician under her supervision, not Blackwell, never Blackwell, to see him. She worked his intake vitals while he sat on the exam table, his medical file open on her tablet. Childhood trauma, Iraq 2003. Shrapnel scars consistent with IED blast. Became an Army Ranger at 22 years old. Assigned to the 75th Ranger Regiment. 12 deployments. Retired at age 41 with a 100% VA disability rating. 20 years. It had been 20 years since Mosul. He kept staring at her hands as she worked, at the scars that covered her forearms like a map of decisions made under fire. When she finished taking his blood pressure, 140/88, elevated but explainable, he signed, "Where did you serve?" Katie didn't hesitate. She'd been rehearsing this answer for 6 months, ever since she'd pulled up Marcus Chen's file and realized that the deaf patient everyone was rejecting was the 8-year-old boy she'd pulled from rubble in the Jolan district, 2003. The boy she'd promised never to forget. The boy whose photograph she'd kept, aged it mentally, cross-referenced it with military records, and finally found him living in Portland under his legal name, waiting for the system to help him and finding only rejection. "I didn't serve," she signed. But her body language contradicted the words. The way she positioned herself with her back never to the door. The way she checked the corners of the room. The way her eyes took in exit points and potential threats. "You're lying," Marcus signed. Not accusatory. Observational. But okay. That night, Katie sat in her car in the hospital parking garage, engine off, studying Marcus's file on her encrypted tablet, the one her handlers had provided when they placed her at Sacred Heart 6 months ago. The mission brief was clear in language written by people in offices with no windows: monitor Marcus Chen. Former translator. Wartime connections create elevated risk profile. Threat assessment indicates hostile actors may attempt contact via medical facilities. Protect asset. Report any suspicious contact. Do not blow cover unless direct threat to asset life emerges. She wasn't a night shift nurse. She was a protection detail. She was an invisible guardian. She was someone who'd made a choice 20 years ago to save a boy from rubble, and now that boy had come to her hospital to be rejected by 10 different doctors, and she couldn't let it happen again. She couldn't fail him twice. She pulled out her jacket from the passenger seat and felt along the interior lining, where the stitches had begun to fray after 2 decades of carrying something that shouldn't have been carried. The unit patch from the 160th SAW Night Stalkers was still there, faded grey, the threads coming loose. It was the only proof she'd ever been anyone but Katie Rodriguez, the invisible night shift nurse. It was proof she'd pulled a boy from rubble. It was proof she'd kept a promise for 20 years. She sewed it tighter that night, in her car, using a needle and thread from a military-issue sewing kit that had never left her possession. 20 years and it was still here. 20 years and she was still sewing. 20 years and the boy was finally back, and this time she wouldn't let him disappear into the system. Not again. Never again. Tuesday morning arrived with the kind of rain that hammered Portland like artillery fire, the kind that made the parking lot steam when it hit the asphalt still warm from yesterday's sun. Katie had already been at Sacred Heart for 6 hours, night shift bleeding into day shift, the overlap where she monitored vitals like a sniper reading wind patterns, seeing what other nurses missed because they were tired and she had never allowed herself that luxury. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed their mechanical song, the one that drove most people insane but that Katie had learned to use as a metronome, a measure of time passing in increments of mercy. Marcus was scheduled for a routine follow-up at 9:47 a.m. Routine. That word meant nothing to Katie anymore. Nothing was routine. Everything was a potential catastrophe wearing the disguise of normalcy. She recognized him the moment he appeared in the clinic hallway, his Ranger PT uniform still creased despite the rain outside, moving with the careful precision of someone who had learned to navigate the world without sound, a skill that required more attention than hearing people could comprehend. He was signing to the intake specialist, his hands moving with the fluency of someone who had spent the last 20 years building a life Katie had made possible. She had done that. In Mosul, in the rubble, she had taught an 8-year-old boy simple hand signs while blood dried on her uniform and medevac helicopters circled overhead like mechanical angels. Now he was a ranger. Now he walked into clinics without apology. Katie was 3 rooms away, ostensibly restocking supplies, when she saw his vitals appear on the central monitor. Blood pressure 168/94. Elevated, but not alarming for a routine exam. Heart rate 88. Normal sinus rhythm. She logged it mentally, filed it away in the compartment of her mind reserved for threat assessment. 45 seconds later, the numbers changed. Blood pressure spiked to 180/110. Heart rate jumped to 127. Katie was moving before the conscious part of her brain had time to catch up, muscle memory taking over, the kind that came from a decade of emergency medicine in combat zones where the difference between moving fast and moving dead was measured in heartbeats. She entered the exam room where a resident named Dr. Chen was listening to Marcus's lungs with a stethoscope, completely unaware that something was fundamentally wrong. Marcus's jugular veins bulged like rope cords beneath his skin. His complexion had shifted to a grayish tint, the color of someone whose oxygen was being rationed by physics rather than biology. His respiratory rate had climbed to 34, he was gasping like an animal pulled from deep water. Cardiac tamponade. The diagnosis crystallized in Katie's mind with the certainty of someone who had seen it before, in a field hospital in Anbar province, where a Marine with a shrapnel wound to the chest had deteriorated exactly like this, bulging neck veins, air hunger, blood pressure that couldn't decide whether to spike or collapse. The fluid was building around his heart, compressing it, strangling it. Minutes now. Maybe less. Katie's voice dropped an octave. Get him supine. Now. Dr. Chen looked up, startled. This is just a supine. Now. Not a request. The words had the weight of command, the kind of tone that made people move without understanding why. Marcus was already reading her lips, already lowering himself onto the exam table, his ranger training recognizing the voice of someone who had seen emergency. His eyes found hers and held. Trust me, she signed with one hand. He nodded once. Katie hit the code button. Her hand was already moving toward the supply cabinet, pulling out a 60 cubic centimeter syringe and a 22-gauge spinal needle with the fluid grace of someone who had done this in the dark, in sandstorms, with rounds impacting the walls around her. She was already prepping the site, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the textbook location burned into muscle memory from 100 training scenarios and 4 real ones that had actually counted. The room was beginning to fill. That was the problem with codes at Sacred Heart. The protocol was to gather, to witness, to form a committee even in crisis. Two nurses appeared in the doorway. A resident from another department. And then Dr. Blackwell, moving with the predatory certainty of a man who had already assessed the situation and decided exactly how it would resolve. "Step away from the patient, Rodriguez." His voice was calm. Controlled. The voice of someone who had done this before, called out the nurse who was overstepping, the one who thought she was a doctor. "We're paging cardiology." Katie's hands continued their work. Antiseptic pad. Circular motion. 2 swipes, letting the iodine dry. She could smell it, sharp, chemical, familiar as blood to a predator. "Cardiology is 6 minutes away," Katie said. "He'll be in cardiac arrest in 4. That's not your assessment to make." The needle was in her hand now. 22 gauge. Sharp as certainty. She was already palpating for the point of insertion, the space between the 3rd and 4th ribs where the pericardium lived, where the fluid was suffocating Marcus's heart in incremental suffocation. Blackwell moved. He actually positioned himself between Katie and the patient, his body language carrying the absolute authority of someone who had spent 15 years establishing dominance in this hospital, who had called board members from fairways, who had cultivated allies the way some people grew gardens. "This nurse is not authorized to perform invasive procedures." That was when the panic could have set in. That was when most people would have hesitated, would have deferred, would have watched the patient die while arguing about credentials. But Katie had operated under worse constraints, under fire, under the impossible mathematics of triage when you had 3 wounded and 1 field hospital tent, when the difference between right and wrong was measured in corpses. She looked at Marcus. His lips were turning blue now. Cyanotic. The blood oxygen dropping like a stone down a well. His respiratory rate had climbed to 42, his body gasping for oxygen that his failing heart couldn't deliver because the fluid around that heart was compressing it, squeezing it like a hand closing around a throat. She looked at the faded unit patch visible through her partially unzipped jacket lining, the one she'd kept for 20 years, sewn into the lining as proof that someone named Katie Rodriguez had once pulled an 8-year-old boy from rubble in Mosul and promised him everything was going to be okay. "Security," Blackwell announced to the gathering crowd. "Someone restrain this nurse." Katie signed to Marcus with both hands now, a 2-word message, "Trust me." He nodded. He closed his eyes. He lay back against the exam table and took a breath that sounded like a death rattle because his heart was drowning. Katie moved with the economy of motion that came from 20 years of operating under constraints that would have paralyzed most people. She positioned the needle. She placed her hand on Marcus's chest, feeling the geography of his ribs, the landscape she'd learned to read like Braille. Her other hand guided the syringe, steady as surgical steel, steady as someone who had done this 4 times and saved 3 of those for lives, who understood that protocol was written by people who had the luxury of time and she did not have time and Marcus was dying and there was nothing in her training that authorized this and everything in her being that demanded it. The needle slid between the ribs. The sensation was almost imperceptible, skin giving way, muscle parting like water, the subtle resistance as she breached the pericardial membrane. The syringe drew back. Dark fluid poured into the chamber. Not the clear yellow of normal pericardial fluid. This was blood. Dark, oxygen-starved, the evidence of internal bleeding that had been accumulating for days, each heartbeat pushing more fluid into the space that should have been empty. 1 chamber full. 2. The pressure releasing like opening a valve, like letting air out of an overinflated tire. The monitor above Marcus's head began to change. Heart rate dropping from 127 to 119. Blood pressure stabilizing at 145/88. Oxygen saturation climbing from 87 to 91, his lungs finally delivering oxygen to blood that could actually move. "I need to know what this was from," Katie said, her hand still steady, the syringe still positioned. "Has he had any chest trauma? Any procedures in the last week?" No one answered. Security hadn't arrived yet. Blackwell was staring at what she'd done with an expression that looked like a man watching the rules of his kingdom being rewritten by someone who had never asked permission. Marcus's eyes opened. He looked at Katie and mouthed a single word, "Thank you." The rain outside the hospital window continued hammering Portland like applause for something that hadn't been supposed to happen, that had been impossible 30 seconds ago and was now being documented by the 3 nurses and 2 residents who had watched a night shift nurse perform an emergency procedure with the confidence of someone who had done this in worse conditions than a climate-controlled hospital with access to sterile equipment. Dr. Blackwell's jaw was tight. Very tight. The kind of tight that came from a man who understood that he had just witnessed something that contradicted the entire structure he had built, the understanding that Katie Rodriguez was invisible, was expendable, was someone who could be broken because she was already broken. But she wasn't broken. She was something else entirely. But that wasn't the worst part for him. The worst part was that everyone in that room had seen it too. But Blackwell didn't accept defeat. He accepted it the way a predator accepts a wound, as information, as a target to eliminate. Within 30 minutes of Marcus's blood pressure stabilizing, within 20 minutes of the cardiology attending nodding at Katie's needle placement with a respect he didn't try to hide, Dr. Blackwell was in his office with his door locked and his phone pressed to his ear like a weapon. The voice on the other end belonged to Richard Hayes, a board member, a man Blackwell had played 18 holes with every summer for 15 years, a man who owed him a favor because Blackwell had kept his daughter's substance abuse case quiet when she'd arrived at Sacred Heart with a dubious story and an empty veins. "Richard. We have a situation." Blackwell's voice was smooth, controlled, the voice of a man who'd learned long ago that fury was a luxury only the powerless could afford. "One of our nursing staff performed an invasive procedure tonight without physician authorization. Cardiac tamponade evacuation. Pericardiocentesis. Textbook dangerous." Hayes listened. Blackwell could hear golf course ambient sound in the background, men laughing, ice clinking in glasses. A late dinner. Perfect. Men at dinner were men who made decisions quickly. "I've already documented it. Risk management will have a report by morning." "But Richard, here's what concerns me, her employment history doesn't add up. References from Portland General that I've been trying to verify all night. Numbers that don't connect. It's possible we hired someone with falsified credentials." He paused. "Let that breathe. I'll handle it, but if this goes sideways, if she sues or if the board finds out we didn't vet our staff properly, it becomes a liability issue." The conversation lasted for minutes. By the time it ended, Blackwell had activated a chain reaction that moved like dominoes falling in slow motion. Richard Hayes would call 2 other board members. Those 2 would call their wives, who would mention it to people at dinner parties. By midnight, the narrative had already crystallized: dangerous nurse, falsified credentials, scope of practice violation, patient safety risk. By 2 a.m., Blackwell had his risk management team mobilized on standby. By 3 a.m., he'd begun making the calls that would destroy Katie's cover. Portland General's administrative line rang at 3:47 a.m. to a recorded message and a voicemail box full of rejected messages. The hospital had never existed outside of a classified government database and a building in Portland's industrial district that had been converted 6 months ago specifically to provide background verification for people exactly like Katie Rodriguez. When Blackwell's team called the dummy numbers the next morning, they reached voice actresses trained to sound like HR directors, trained to confirm employment for exactly 42 seconds before the connection mysteriously dropped. But Blackwell wasn't stupid. Blackwell was strategic. The hesitation in their voices, the way the confirmation came too quickly, the slight electronic lag in the connection, these were tells. These were tells that Richard Hayes would understand, that any board member would understand. Falsified credentials meant lawsuits. Falsified credentials meant hospital liability. Falsified credentials meant Katie Rodriguez wasn't who she claimed to be. At 4:15 a.m., Blackwell contacted the outside risk management firm that Sacred Heart kept on retainer, a firm that had cost him exactly $12,000 in consulting fees over the past 3 years, fees paid directly to a senior partner who owed him gratitude for a colonoscopy performed after hours that had found a malignancy when a hospital-verified CT scan had missed it. The firm director answered on the second ring, already awake, already dressed, already understanding that Blackwell wouldn't call at 4 a.m. unless the situation was significant. By 6 a.m., the risk management team had assembled a preliminary report: breach of scope of practice, unauthorized invasive procedure, employment history inconsistencies, pattern of overstepping clinical boundaries documented by multiple staff members. Dr. Blackwell had been thorough. He'd interviewed the ER attending who'd watched Katie with something approaching awe, and the attending had confirmed every detail: the needle placement, the precision, the speed. He'd interviewed the cardiology resident who'd arrived after, who'd examined Marcus's chest and said, "This is flawless work. This is someone who's done this before." He documented it all with the precision of a man building a case for war crimes prosecution. Because that's what Katie's competence had become in Blackwell's narrative of a crime. Her skill was the evidence of her guilt. Her inability to hide what she knew proved she didn't belong here. By 6:30 a.m., as the Portland sky turned the color of old concrete, Katie was called to the HR office. She walked through the pre-dawn darkness of Sacred Heart's corridors the way she'd walked through Mosul streets 20 years earlier, with the calm of someone who'd already accepted the worst outcome and found it manageable. She didn't know yet that her entire carefully constructed life was about to collapse. She didn't know that Blackwell had spent the night weaponizing her competence against her. She didn't know that the job she'd held for 17 months as nothing more than a cover was about to be stripped away, leaving her exposed, leaving Marcus exposed, leaving the boy from the rubble of Mosul vulnerable to every threat she'd spent 20 years trying to prevent. The HR director, a woman named Patricia Strand with the exhausted eyes of someone who'd been told to fire people she liked, wouldn't meet Katie's gaze. "We're terminating your employment effective immediately. Protocol violations. Patient safety concerns. Your employment history has raised questions that we're unable to resolve." Patricia slid a manila folder across the desk. "You'll receive 30 days severance. You'll sign a non-disparagement agreement. Security will escort you to your locker and then to the exit." Katie didn't speak. She took the folder. She signed the papers with the same steady hand that had inserted a needle into a man's chest 8 hours earlier, the same hand that had once held shrapnel-torn tissue together while waiting for a medevac helicopter that might never arrive. The sound of pen on paper was the sound of her mission ending. The sound of protocol being followed. The sound of Blackwell's strategy working perfectly. She was escorted to her locker by a security guard named Thompson, a kind man who'd worked at Sacred Heart for 19 years and who looked like he wanted to say something but understood that kindness wasn't his job right now. Her locker contained the scrubs she'd cycled through, a pair of compression socks with the heel worn thin, and the faded unit patch sewn inside the lining of her jacket, the patch from the 75th Ranger Regiment, the patch from Mosul, the only physical proof of who she'd actually been, which she'd hidden so carefully that even her own hands had stopped remembering it was there. She took the jacket. She left everything else. By 7:15 a.m., Katie was standing in the parking lot of Sacred Heart, watching her security escort walk back toward the building's entrance. The Portland air tasted like diesel and morning rain. The sky was the color of gunmetal. She understood immediately what had happened, understood with the terrible clarity that came from 2 decades of reading threats and countering moves. Blackwell had recognized her as a danger and had responded with institutional precision. He'd weaponized the system. He'd turned her competence into evidence of her unsuitability. And in doing so, he'd eliminated her access to the hospital. He'd eliminated her ability to monitor Marcus Chen. The boy from Mosul, the 8-year-old she'd pulled from rubble, the child she'd taught simple signs to while waiting for medevac, the reason she'd taken a job as an invisible night shift nurse at a hospital in Portland, was now vulnerable to every threat she'd detected circling him like sharks. She'd seen the man in the ER waiting room twice. She'd recognized the pattern of surveillance. She'd identified the connection to the trafficking network that had followed her home from Iraq like a stain that wouldn't wash off. And now she had no access. No badge. No position inside the hospital walls. No way to protect him. At 3 a.m., Katie sat in Powell's Coffee on Powell Boulevard, in a booth with cracked vinyl seats that had been worn soft by 17 years of insomnia, watching her coffee turn cold. The cup had been full 3 hours ago. Now it sat untouched, a mirror reflecting nothing but the fluorescent light overhead and the darkness of a woman who'd been invisible so long that she'd become a ghost. She stared at her reflection in the darkened window beside the booth, at the shape of a woman in scrubs, at the outline of a jacket with a patch sewn into the lining that no one was supposed to see. The faded fabric beneath the thread showed the wear of 2 decades. The Ranger tab. The scroll with the scroll. The color of old blood and older loyalty. She'd failed him twice now. Once in 2003, when she was a 19-year-old corpsman attached to a Ranger platoon and the evacuation helicopter had been delayed by sandstorm, and she'd made the choice to leave him with the Red Crescent aid workers, pressing her unit patch into his small hand so he'd have proof that someone had found him, that someone had seen him alive. Once tonight, when she'd been so focused on the procedure, so focused on saving his life in that moment, that she hadn't anticipated a man like Blackwell would respond by destroying the entire infrastructure that kept Marcus safe. The coffee on the table had rings of cream floating on its surface like oil on water. Her hands wrapped around the cup but didn't lift it. The trembling wasn't fear. The trembling was restraint. The trembling was the sound of a person who'd survived Mosul, survived 20 years of pretending to be someone she wasn't, surviving the weight of a secret so heavy it had become part of her skeleton. And now she was sitting in a diner at 3 a.m., fired, exposed, unable to access the one person she'd spent 2 decades trying to protect. What she didn't know yet was that everything was about to change. What she didn't know was that someone had been watching this play out. What she didn't know was that the moment Dr. Blackwell had activated his network, he'd activated hers, the network of people who'd trained her, who'd sent her to Sacred Heart specifically to watch Marcus Chen, who had protocols of their own for situations exactly like this one. But that wasn't the thing that was about to happen. The thing about to happen was something Blackwell could never have anticipated, something no amount of golf course favors or institutional leverage could defend against. The thing about to happen had already been set in motion by a man who'd seen Katie's face in that ER, who'd recognized the call sign the insurgent had shouted, and who had already made a phone call to a number that didn't exist on any directory, to a general whose command authority extended far beyond the jurisdiction of Sacred Heart Hospital or the state of Oregon or anything Dr. Blackwell understood about the architecture of the nation he'd spent his entire life trying to navigate from a position of privilege. At 3:47 a.m., Katie's phone vibrated against the table, a text from a number she didn't recognize. "Stay where you are. You're about to be contacted by someone very senior. Listen to what he has to say. And don't trust a word Blackwell told you about your employment history." She didn't recognize the number. But she recognized the syntax. She recognized the brevity. She recognized the voice of someone military, someone who understood operational security, someone who knew exactly where to find her at 3:47 in the morning in a diner on Powell Boulevard. Everything she'd built in 17 months of invisibility had collapsed. Everything she'd constructed so carefully had been dismantled by a petty man with a surgeon's hands and a vindictive heart. But what was about to happen would require rebuilding on a scale she'd never anticipated, with stakes higher than she'd imagined possible, and with a boy from Mosul standing at the center of it all. The investigator arrived on a Tuesday morning with a file folder the thickness of a phone book and a question that would unravel everything Dr. Blackwell had constructed. His name was Marcus Chen, different Marcus, coincidence that felt like a knife twist, and he worked for the risk management firm that Blackwell had hired to destroy Katie Rodriguez. The irony was so complete it almost qualified as poetry. The outside team had come to confirm her incompetence. Instead, they found his. Dr. Blackwell claimed Rodriguez falsified credentials, the investigator said, his voice carrying through the hospital administrator's office like a gavel strike. He laid down a printout. Her naval special warfare clearance is higher than anything in this hospital's database. Multiple tiers higher. We ran verification through Dodd directly. He watched the administrator's face drain. His claims about credential fraud don't survive basic background check. Then came the surgical records audit. That was the moment the wheel separated from the cart entirely. 18 months of post-operative documentation. Notes Blackwell had written personally. Complications he'd listed as resolved without incident, but the nursing logs, Katie's nursing logs specifically, documented extended ICU stays. patients he'd coded as stable who required emergency transfer to specialized facilities. Infections marked minor that necessitated surgical revision. The numbers climbed: 3 improper discharge summaries, 7 incomplete incident reports, 1 patient readmission that should have triggered a peer review but somehow never reached the medical board. Katie's chart corrections, the one she'd made quietly at 3 in the morning while the rest of the hospital slept, those corrections had been catching his cover-ups. Ms. Rodriguez wasn't overstepping scope of practice, the investigator continued, now sitting across from the hospital board members in a conference room that suddenly smelled like fear and antiseptic. She was performing quality assurance. Her interventions prevented at least 2 cases from escalating to litigation. We estimate her documentation saved Sacred Heart roughly $400,000 in malpractice exposure alone. The golf buddies started distancing themselves immediately. One board member called to say he'd been misled by Dr. Blackwell's representations. Another suddenly remembered a prior commitment. The surgical privileges suspension came through by Wednesday afternoon, pending formal medical board review. The ICU supervisor was deposed and testified without hesitation. She'd sought Katie's opinion because Blackwell's orders had become increasingly inconsistent with best practices and concerning to nursing staff. Then the nurses came forward. The elevator incident. The staff meeting humiliation with the outdated protocols quiz while colleagues squirmed in their seats. The locker, spray-painted with a slur that dripped like blood. Each incident documented with dates, times, and witnesses. Pattern recognition that built itself like a medical diagnosis, presenting complaint progressing to acute clinical deterioration. The hospital's legal team realized with cold clarity that they were exposed to massive liability under Title VII employment law, hostile work environment statutes, and potentially criminal harassment charges depending on the jurisdiction. By Friday, Dr. Blackwell was cleaning out his office. His hands shook as he packed the diplomas. The framed board certifications. The photo of his golf foursome from the club where he'd spent 18 years cultivating the network that had just abandoned him. Through the window, he watched Katie stand in the lobby talking with a 2-star general in dress uniform. Marcus Chen beside them in his Ranger dress blues. The 3 of them laughing about something, about a joke, about a memory, about a debt that had finally come due. Blackwell's weapon, the investigation and the network and the institutional power, had turned back on him with the same forensic precision he'd intended for her. In military terms, they called it friendly fire. 6 months later, Dr. Blackwell worked at a strip mall urgent care clinic wedged between a vape shop and a bail bondsman. Strep throats and sprained ankles and work note signed for $12 an hour above minimum wage. His medical license remained valid, technically speaking, but his reputation in Portland had burned beyond recovery. Nurses from Sacred Heart spoke his name only in warning. Other physicians avoided him at conferences. The golf buddies had moved on to a new surgeon, younger and less complicated, without a history of altered records and harassment allegations. Meanwhile, Katie Rodriguez stood in her navy dress whites at a VA hospital ribbon-cutting ceremony. The new facility rose behind her like a monument, the combat trauma wing funded by her Navy Cross recognition and designed to serve deaf veterans specifically. 18,000 square feet of clinical space, specialized equipment for tactile communication during emergencies, visual alert systems, and a staff trained in military sign language. Marcus Chen stood beside her in his Ranger dress uniform, now serving as a liaison between military medicine and civilian care, bridge builder between the world he'd been born into and the world that had rejected him before Katie intervened. On the wall behind them, the faded unit patch from Mosul. Professionally framed now, with a plaque reading HM1 Katie Rodriguez and SSG Marcus Chen, Mosul 2003. The name and rank and date, finally public after 2 decades of invisible service. A general, an actual 2-star, not her handler but the real thing, stepped forward and pinned new director credentials to Katie's uniform. She'd taken the position. Her cover work was complete. Her real calling finally aligned with her public identity, no more night shifts and mediocrity, just forward momentum and a title that meant something because the person wearing it had earned it across 18 classified operations and the lives she'd saved in the dark. Reporters asked how it felt to be recognized after 20 years of classified service. Katie looked at Marcus, signed something that made him laugh, real laughter, not the careful kind, the kind that came from people who understood each other at cellular level. Then she turned to the cameras, and her voice had changed. Not deferential anymore. Not careful. The voice of a woman who'd held nothing back because she'd already held back for 2 decades and the interest had compounded. I didn't need recognition, she said. I needed to do the work. Then she added, looking directly at the camera lens, power is not a title. Power is the ability to help. The facility opened its doors to its first patient, a deaf Marine who'd been turned away from 11 civilian hospitals. Katie greeted him in tactical sign language, hands moving with the same precision she'd used in Mosul to teach a terrified 8-year-old boy how to communicate during a medevac. His eyes filled with tears, the kind that came from finally being seen by someone who understood the weight of invisible wounds. Across town, in a strip mall parking lot, Dr. Blackwell sat in his car during lunch break and a notification arrived on his phone. Katie Rodriguez, named Director of Combat Trauma Services, VA Pacific Northwest. The headline included a photo, her in whites, Marcus in uniform, both of them smiling like people who'd survived something that should have killed them. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in his career, he understood exactly how small he'd always been. Some debts take 20 years to repay, but they always come due. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever watched someone's true strength emerge after years of invisibility, subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. Share this video with someone who needs to remember that the quietest person in the room might be the one holding it all together. And comment below, when has underestimation revealed itself as someone's greatest advantage?